I sat behind the wheel of my old silver sedan, the engine idling softly, boxes stacked neatly in the backseat like silent witnesses to my humiliation. The house in front of me glowed with the warm afternoon light, the same house I had once called my dream, the one I'd poured my savings and my heart into so my son could build a life of comfort. I could still see the paint strokes from when I helped finish the porch railings, my fingerprints hidden beneath layers of white gloss. Now it wasn't mine anymore. David's voice still rang in my ears, low and uneasy. "Mom, please understand, it's just temporary. Clara's mother needs the room more." Temporary, the word cut deeper than he knew. I had said yes because that's what mothers do. We say yes even when our hearts beg us not to. But deep down I knew this wasn't temporary. I saw it in his eyes when he couldn't hold my gaze, when Clara stood behind him, arms folded, lips pressed tight with the satisfaction of someone who'd won. I looked up at the window of what used to be my room. The curtains I'd sewn myself fluttered lightly in the breeze. A shadow moved inside. For a fleeting second I thought it was David, maybe coming to stop me, to apologize, to tell me it was all a mistake. But it wasn't him. It was Clara's mother, Margaret, settling into her new place as if she'd lived there all along. The front door opened and they both stepped out. Clara in her tailored blouse, looking every bit the queen of the house, and Margaret right beside her, waving like royalty, greeting a loyal subject. I wanted to hate them. I wanted to scream. But all I could do was sit there, hands trembling against the steering wheel, wondering how love could turn into something so cold. David came out a moment later, standing awkwardly on the porch steps. "Drive safe, Mom," he said, his voice small, rehearsed. I nodded because if I opened my mouth, I knew my tears would spill over. He stepped forward as if he wanted to hug me, then stopped himself. Clara touched his arm, and that was all it took. He stayed where he was. The memory of his childhood flashed before me, a 5-year-old boy clutching my hand at the fair, terrified of losing me in the crowd. A teenager crying when I worked double shifts so he could go to college. The young man who once said, "Mom, when I make it big, you'll never have to worry again." I believed him. I built my whole world around that promise. Now, as I sat there with my car full of memories, I realized how foolish that faith had been. I had traded my independence for proximity, my savings for a sense of belonging that was never truly mine. The tears came slowly at first, then heavier, blurring the driveway, the porch, the life I was leaving behind. I turned the key, and the sound of the engine seemed louder than before, like it was trying to drown out everything I didn't want to feel. I glanced one last time at the house, at the flowers I had planted by the mailbox, blooming despite the cold. Then I whispered, almost to myself, I never thought my own child would evict me. As I pulled away, the house grew smaller in my rearview mirror, but the ache in my chest grew larger. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the road ahead blurred with my tears. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice said this wasn't the end, but I didn't believe it then. I thought I was just another mother being forgotten. If only I'd known that this goodbye was the beginning of something far greater. I wasn't born into much, but I was born with hands that knew how to work. My parents ran a small grocery store in a town so tiny you could walk from one end to the other before the morning church bell stopped ringing. From them, I learned early that dignity doesn't come from what you have, it comes from what you give. That lesson carried me through everything that came after. When I married Samuel Mitchell, I thought I'd found my forever partner. He was steady, kind, the sort of man who listened before he spoke. We opened a little bakery together on Main Street, Mitchell's Oven. Our days began before sunrise, and by the time the first rays of light hit the windows, the smell of fresh bread would already drift through town. People came not just for pastries, but for peace. We became part of everyone's mornings, their celebrations, their small joys. But life has a way of turning suddenly. When Samuel died of a heart attack at 48, the bakery became my lifeline and my refuge. I would knead dough until my hands ached just to silence the grief inside me. And when David, our only child, was born, that grief found a new purpose. I promised myself I would give him everything his father couldn't. Raising a son alone wasn't easy. There were nights when I'd stay up finishing orders with him asleep in a cot beside the ovens, his tiny fingers curled around my apron string. I still remember the first time he called me his hero. He couldn't have been more than 7, and he had drawn a little picture of me standing behind the bakery counter, a cape around my shoulders. "You save people with cookies," he'd said. I kept that drawing pinned to the kitchen corkboard for decades. Years passed and the bakery grew. I hired help, learned to keep books, and paid off the mortgage on our small home. When David got into university, something neither Samuel nor I ever dreamed possible, I sold half my savings to make sure he went without worry. He was my pride, my legacy, my reason to keep going. Every loaf I baked, every dollar I saved felt like an offering to his future. When David brought Clara home for the first time, I remember thinking how lucky he was. She was poised, educated, full of bright ideas. I baked her favorite dessert, chocolate eclairs, after he mentioned them in passing. She called me Mom almost right away, and my heart melted. I thought, finally, we're not just two anymore, we're a family again. When they got married, I insisted on paying for part of the down payment on their new house. It wasn't much, but it was my blessing, a piece of me going into their next chapter. After the wedding, they asked me to move in with them. It'll be good for all of us, David said. You'll have company and we'll save you the trouble of living alone. I hesitated, but the truth was I didn't want to be alone either, so I sold the bakery, my last tie to the life Samuel and I had built, and handed David the check. For your dreams, I told him. He hugged me so tightly that day, tears in his eyes. You'll never regret this, Mom. At first, it felt like I wouldn't. The house buzzed with laughter and the smell of home-cooked dinners. I helped Clara in the kitchen, picked up my grandson from school, and kept the house running when they were at work. The joy of having family around filled every empty corner I once feared. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching David play catch with his son, and think this is what all those years were for. But little changes crept in like quiet shadows. Clara started taking over the cooking. You don't have to cook tonight, Mom, I've got it, she'd say, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. At first, I took it as kindness. Then she began redecorating, new curtains, new dishes, replacing things I had once picked with care. The house started to look less like mine and more like something from a magazine that didn't have room for old memories. David was always polite but distant. When I offered advice about their son, he'd say, Mom, we've got it covered. It wasn't cruel, just cold enough to sting. Even the little things changed, no more asking me to join them for movie nights, fewer goodnight hugs from my grandson. I told myself it was just modern life, that young people liked their space. But deep down, I could feel the edges of my world shrinking. Sometimes, I'd wake early and wander into the kitchen just to make coffee before anyone else was up. Those quiet mornings reminded me of my bakery days, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint aroma of yeast still lingering in my memory. I'd sit with my cup, watching the first light slide through the blinds, and tell myself I was still needed, still part of something. But that belief started to tremble the day Clara's mother began visiting more often. The air in the house shifted when she was around, small whispers between her and Clara, little looks exchanged during dinner, as if there was some unspoken plan I wasn't part of. I didn't understand it then, but something inside me knew. The home I helped build was slowly becoming a place I didn't belong. And the silence between those walls would soon be louder than any argument I'd ever known. Those first years living with David and Clara were some of the happiest I could remember. Every morning began with the smell of toast and laughter from the kitchen. My grandson Ethan would come running down the stairs in his pajamas, sliding across the wooden floor and straight into my arms. I'd scoop him up and say, "You're getting too big for this," but secretly I prayed he never would be. The days had rhythm, a sweetness that reminded me of the bakery, steady, warm, full of life. I'd pack Ethan's lunch for school, humming the same tune Samuel used to whistle while kneading dough. Clara worked from home then, and though she was always busy, we'd share coffee sometimes on the porch. She'd tell me about her clients, and I'd tell her about the bakery's old customers who still called just to chat. There was an ease between us, a friendship I thought was real. David would come home tired but smiling, his tie loosened, his arm around Clara as he kissed her cheek. "Smells like heaven in here," he'd say whenever I cooked dinner. I loved that how food could still draw him back to the table no matter how long the day. On weekends, I'd bake cookies with Ethan. He'd sit on the counter, covered in flour, sneaking chocolate chips when he thought I wasn't looking. "Grandma, don't tell Mom," he'd whisper with a grin that looked just like David's when he was his age. Sometimes I'd step out into the backyard while the cookies baked, feeling the sun on my face as I tended to my small patch of garden. It wasn't much, just a few rose bushes, herbs, and a tomato vine, but it grounded me. Life had slowed down, but in the best way. After years of running a business and raising a child alone, I finally felt like I could rest. I believed I had found safety in family, peace in purpose. I remember one particular evening vividly. We had set up a small table outside for dinner because the weather was perfect, one of those golden evenings where the air feels kind. Clara had lit candles, and David poured lemonade into glasses while Ethan chased fireflies. For a moment I thought, this is everything I ever wanted. Watching my son laugh with his wife, hearing my grandson's giggles echo through the yard, I felt like Samuel was there too, smiling somewhere unseen. But peace has a fragile nature. It doesn't announce when it's leaving, it just begins to fade quietly. It started with Margaret's visits. At first they seemed harmless enough. Clara said her mother was lonely after retiring, and I understood that. I welcomed her, brewed her tea, even baked her favorite lemon bars. She'd sit at the table, polite and chatty, asking questions about the house or complimenting Ethan's manners. But soon the compliments turned to comments. "This kitchen feels a bit old-fashioned, doesn't it?" she'd say, tapping her long nails against the counter. "You could really open up the space, make it more modern." Clara would nod thoughtfully, and I'd smile faintly, pretending not to notice the judgment hiding in those words. Another day, as I served my roast chicken, a family recipe passed down from my mother Margaret tasted a bite and said, "It's lovely, Eleanor, though you might try using olive oil next time instead of butter, it's healthier." Clara agreed quickly, scribbling something in her notebook as if my cooking needed revising. They started spending afternoons rearranging things. The old quilt I'd draped on the couch disappeared one day. The antique clock Samuel had fixed with his own hands was moved to the basement for safekeeping. The curtains I'd chosen soft blue, matching the kitchen tiles, were replaced with sleek white blinds. I told myself it didn't matter, they were just things. But every change felt like a small erasure, a quiet rewriting of the home story. I remember one morning finding Margaret in the garden, pruning my roses without asking. "These poor things are too crowded," she said, clipping away petals that had just started to bloom. "You have to be bold with change, Eleanor." I stood there trying to smile. "Yes, but even roses deserve time to grow in their own space," I replied softly. She laughed, not really hearing me. Clara began echoing her mother's phrases. "Mom says this, Mom thinks that." Little by little, Margaret's voice filled the house more than mine ever had. I started to feel like a guest in a place I'd helped build. My advice about Ethan's school or David's work was met with polite nods and quick subject changes. I'd catch myself going quiet at dinner, folding my napkin neatly while they talked over me. David didn't seem to notice the shift. He was busier than ever, working late, tired when he got home. I didn't want to burden him, so I swallowed my discomfort. I told myself families go through phases. Maybe I was being sensitive, maybe I was too attached. But small wounds add up. I began waking up earlier just to have a few hours of peace before the household stirred. I'd sip my coffee on the porch and watch the light climb over the garden. The roses were thinner now, their blooms sparse after Margaret's trimming. They looked like I felt still alive but stripped back. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I wandered into the kitchen to put away dishes. I found a note on the counter, Margaret's handwriting. "We should consider converting Eleanor's room into an office. Clara deserves her own workspace." My chest tightened as I stared at it. I placed it gently in the trash and went to my room, heart thudding like a drum. When I closed the door, I noticed the framed photo of me, Samuel, and David on the dresser. It had been turned slightly away as if someone couldn't bear to look at it. I fixed it, sat on the edge of my bed, and let out a long breath. Something was changing under this roof. I could feel it in the way Clara's smile no longer reached her eyes, in the way David avoided small conversations, in the way Margaret lingered as if waiting for me to slip up. The piece I had built my life around was unraveling thread by quiet thread. I didn't understand it then, but that calm, the laughter, the dinners, the shared mornings wasn't the beginning of peace. It was the soft, deceptive quiet before the storm I never saw coming. It began, as most heartbreaks do, with something that looked like kindness. One morning, Clara announced over breakfast that her mother had fallen and injured her knee. She spoke softly, eyes glistening with concern. "She can't manage the stairs at her house right now. The doctor says she needs someone around for a few weeks." Before I could even respond, David nodded. "Of course she can stay here, we have the space." He said it so naturally, so decisively, that it didn't even feel like a discussion. I smiled and agreed it was the right thing to do, wasn't it? Families help one another, that's what I'd taught him his whole life. So we prepared the guest room. I added fresh sheets, baked a lemon cake, and told myself I'd make Margaret feel welcome. When she arrived, hobbling slightly on her cane, I greeted her at the door. "Make yourself at home," I said sincerely. She smiled thinly and replied, "I'll try." I thought that was the start of peace. It was actually the start of my erasure. At first, everything seemed fine. I helped her with tea, offered to cook meals soft enough for her recovery, and even massaged her knee with warm cloths the way I used to when David scraped his legs as a boy. She thanked me, though her tone carried a faint impatience, as if my help were expected rather than appreciated. Days turned to weeks. Her things began to spill out of the guest room: books, blankets, her favorite chair from her house. One afternoon, I found her sorting through the pantry. "You have too many duplicates," she said briskly. "I'm organizing things more efficiently." I wanted to protest, but David walked in at that moment and smiled approvingly. "Good idea, Margaret. Mom's always been too generous with supplies." I laughed lightly, pretending not to feel the sting. It was easier than explaining that my generosity came from years of running a bakery. Keeping full shelves meant no one went hungry. But the way they looked at me made me feel like an outdated manual, no longer useful. Every day, the house felt smaller. My garden became her therapy spot. My seat at the table was moved to make more space for her leg. My stories about Ethan's school days were gently interrupted by Clara with, "Mom already heard that, Eleanor." It was like being slowly written out of my own script. One evening, I walked into the living room to find Margaret hosting what looked like a book club. 4 women I didn't know were sitting on my couch, drinking tea from my porcelain cups. "Oh," Margaret said airily, "I hope you don't mind. We needed somewhere cozy to meet." She didn't even pause to see my reaction. Clara appeared behind me, smiling nervously. "It's just once a week, Eleanor. You'll love them." But I didn't love them. I didn't love the way one of them whispered, "So this is where she's been staying," or how they complimented Clara's lovely decorating taste while sitting beneath a quilt I had hand-stitched. I stayed long enough to serve them cookies, then retreated to my room, what was left of it. A month later, I found a pair of Margaret's slippers under my bed. When I mentioned it to Clara, she waved it off. "Oh, she probably went in to look for her glasses or something." I nodded slowly, but that night I started locking my door. David, meanwhile, seemed oblivious. He was working long hours, coming home late, exhausted. When I tried to tell him I was feeling crowded, he squeezed my shoulder. "Just hang in there, Mom, it's temporary." Temporary, the same word again, the one that had started this unraveling. But temporary turned into permanent before I could catch my breath. Margaret's recovery stretched into months, and the house rearranged itself around her presence. She got her own shelf in the pantry, her own drawer in the hallway, her own recliner near the window. My garden, my roses became our joint project. She even hired a landscaper without asking me. I remember one morning I went outside to trim the herbs and found all the clay pots gone. In their place stood metal planters, neat and sterile. A white tag stuck out from one of them, "Gifted by Margaret." I felt my throat tighten. I turned the soil between my fingers, missing the rough texture of the earth. My hands, once strong from years of baking, trembled with quiet rage. Dinner that night was the moment everything cracked. We were all at the table: David, Clara, Margaret, little Ethan. The conversation turned to the upcoming holiday, and Margaret mentioned casually, "I was thinking perhaps Eleanor could visit her old friends for a few weeks. It would be good for her to get out." I froze. "I don't have anywhere to go," I said softly. Margaret smiled, polite and sharp. "Surely there are some people in town who'd love to have you. Besides, it's getting a little crowded here with my recovery equipment." Clara jumped in quickly. "Mom's just suggesting a little break, that's all." David didn't look at me, he just nodded, staring down at his plate. My fork clattered against the table. A break from what? From my family. Silence stretched. Ethan looked confused, glancing from me to his parents. Finally, David spoke, still avoiding my eyes. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it already is. Margaret needs peace while she heals, and it's not fair to have two mothers under one roof. It's temporary." There it was again, temporary, that word that erased me every time it was spoken. I pushed back my chair and stood slowly. My voice was calm, but inside I felt the floor tilting. "So you're asking me to leave my home, the home I helped you buy, the home I sold my bakery to build?" David's face twisted with guilt. "It's not like that. You'll always have a place here, just not right now." Margaret sighed dramatically. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Eleanor. It's just until things settle down." I looked at her, then at Clara, who wouldn't meet my gaze. Finally, I looked at my son, the boy I once held through every fever, every heartbreak. "I understand," I said quietly. "You want peace." He nodded, "Just for a little while." I forced a smile that felt like it might break my face. "Then peace is what you'll have." That night, I packed my things, not everything, just what I could fit into a few boxes. My photo albums, my husband's watch, the quilt Samuel and I used to wrap ourselves in during winter storms. I labeled each box carefully, though my vision blurred through tears. As I carried them to the car, the house felt alien, too quiet, too pristine. I paused by the kitchen door and looked around. The counters gleamed, the blinds were perfectly straight, and the faint scent of Margaret's perfume lingered in the air. My reflection in the window looked smaller than I remembered. Clara appeared behind me. "I'm sorry, Eleanor, I didn't want it to be like this." I turned to her, tired but composed. "Then why is it?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "Mom didn't mean." "Your mother meant every word," I interrupted. My voice wasn't angry, it was just hollow, and so did David. I walked past her, out into the cool night. The sky was clear, full of stars that refused to dim even for heartbreak. As I loaded the last box, I heard the front door open. David stood there, hands shoved into his pockets, staring at the ground. "Drive safe, Mom," he murmured. I wanted to say 1,000 things to remind him of promises, of love, of everything I'd given up so he could have this life. But I didn't, I just nodded. "Take care of them," I said instead. Then I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away from the only home I thought I'd never lose. Behind me, the lights in the house flickered once and went out. Ahead, the road stretched long and empty. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and for the first time in years, I realized I had no destination, just distance. I didn't know it then, but that moment being cast out by my own child wasn't the end of my story. It was the spark that would light a fire I'd never thought I still had in me. The first night in my new apartment was the quietest night of my life. I sat on the edge of a narrow bed surrounded by cardboard boxes and the faint smell of dust. The walls were bare, the air heavy, and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I could hear the neighbors through the thin plaster, muffled laughter, the clink of plates, a television murmuring somewhere far away. It all made the silence inside my space feel louder. I ate dinner alone that night, soup from a can, warmed on a stove that clicked twice before lighting. I placed my bowl on a small wooden table I'd found secondhand, and I stared at the steam rising from it. I told myself it was just for a few weeks, that David would call soon, that he'd say he missed me and ask me to come back. I believed that lie because the truth that I had been replaced was too sharp to hold. Days bled into each other. Morning sunlight filtered through thin curtains I'd bought at a discount shop, dust floating like tiny ghosts in the air. I tried to keep busy knitting, cleaning, baking small batches of bread just to smell something familiar. But when the bread cooled, there was no one to share it with. I'd call David sometimes just to hear his voice. He always answered kindly but quickly. "Hey Mom, everything okay? We've just got a lot going on right now." Then silence, the kind that waits for you to say goodbye. I tried to talk to Ethan, but Clara often said he was busy with school or visiting his grandmother, the other grandmother. My chest would tighten every time I heard that word. Loneliness does strange things to time. Some days, hours dragged like years, others passed in blinks. I'd find myself standing at the window, watching people hurry past, their lives intact, their families beside them. I wondered if anyone could see me from outside, the old woman who had everything once, now reduced to four walls and echoes. But grief can't live forever without turning into something else. One morning, I woke up with a dull ache behind my ribs, not pain exactly, but a restlessness I hadn't felt in months. I got dressed, combed my hair, and decided to walk to the market for fresh vegetables. Maybe small movement could keep my heart from rusting shut. The market was busy that Saturday, voices calling out prices, children tugging at their parents, the smell of spices and earth filling the air. It reminded me of the bakery's early mornings, of community and noise and belonging. I was picking through a basket of apples when two women beside me started chatting, their voices low but urgent. "Did you hear about that bakery building on Main Street?" one said. "Margaret's telling everyone David's going to sell it to some cafe owner from the city, says they'll make a fortune off the space." My hand froze midair. The bakery building, my bakery building. "Isn't that place tied to his mother somehow?" the other woman asked, tilting her head. "Oh, who knows," the first replied. "Apparently they took care of all that when they sold it years ago. Still, funny how her name's still on the old deed. Guess they'll have to fix that before they sell." Their laughter felt like a match dropped in dry grass. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. "Excuse me," I said as gently as I could. "Did you say the deed still has Eleanor Mitchell's name on it?" The women looked startled, one nodded cautiously. "I think so, yes. It was in the paper when the property taxes updated last month." I thanked them and walked away before my knees could give out. The world tilted slightly around me, sounds muffled, faces blurred. I clutched my grocery bag tight against my chest and made my way home, every step echoing with the same thought, the deed. The deed is still in my name. Back in my apartment, I dug through my old file box, the one I'd taken without even thinking, the one labeled personal. Receipts, insurance papers, a stack of yellowed photographs. And then, tucked inside a manila envelope, I found it, the original property deed for Mitchell's oven. My name, clear as day, written in neat black ink. Owner, Eleanor Mitchell. I sank onto the floor, the paper trembling in my hands. All those years of work, of flour and sweat, of 4 a.m. mornings and burnt fingers, it wasn't gone, not yet. I flipped through the rest of the envelope. There were bank receipts, 2 documents from when I sold the business to help David buy his home. I'd never noticed before, but the funds were transferred to my account, not his. The arrangement had been verbal, never formalized in writing. I had simply given him the money, trusting him completely. The sale profits, nearly everything I had, were still legally mine. I leaned back against the wall, letting that realization settle in. For months, I had felt powerless, erased. But here, in my trembling hands, was proof that I still existed in more ways than one. I could have marched straight to David's house that very moment, banged on the door, and demanded an explanation. But something inside me shifted instead, a strange calm, a clarity that only comes when you've been broken enough times to recognize your own strength. I wasn't going to beg for acknowledgement anymore. I was going to teach them something they'd never forget. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the deed laid out before me. The edges curled slightly from age, the ink faded in places, but it was still valid, still mine. I thought of Margaret's smug smile, of Clara's polite pity, of David's lowered eyes. And then I thought of Samuel, of how proud he'd be if he knew I hadn't lost myself completely. Maybe, I whispered into the quiet, it's time they remember whose name built that family. The next morning, I called my old lawyer, Mr. Rosen. He answered in the same warm voice I remembered. Eleanor Mitchell, it's been years, what can I do for you? I need to check something, I said, something about property ownership and inheritance. He chuckled, still keeping people on their toes, I see, come by Monday, bring your papers. When I hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the faded wallpaper of my little apartment. For the first time since I'd left that house, I didn't feel like a victim sitting in exile. I felt like someone quietly sharpening a blade of justice, not to harm, but to reclaim. I glanced at the deed again, the familiar letters of my name anchoring me back to who I was. That bakery wasn't just a building. It was my life story in brick and flour, and now it would be my voice when words failed. Outside, the sky was turning gold with dawn. I opened the window, letting the cool air wash over me. Somewhere in that morning light, the woman I used to be, strong, capable, unyielding, stirred awake. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. The same hands that built everything they took for granted were not done yet. And this time, I wouldn't need anyone's permission to rise. When Monday came, I dressed with more care than I had in months. A soft gray blouse, the pearl earrings Samuel had given me on our 10th anniversary, and the same leather handbag I used to carry contracts in when the bakery first opened. The sky was clear, the kind of quiet blue that makes you believe new beginnings might still exist for old souls. Mr. Rosen's office sat above the florists on Main Street, and walking past, the scent of roses and lilacs felt almost symbolic. He hadn't changed much, still that easy smile, still the spectacles perched at the edge of his nose. Eleanor Mitchell, he said, standing to shake my hand. Now that's a name I haven't seen on paper in too long. I smiled, handing him the folder. Let's see if it still means something. He flipped through the papers, humming thoughtfully, the room filled with the rustle of pages and the ticking of his old brass clock. Finally, he looked up. Well, you've been sitting on quite the treasure, my friend. What do you mean? You still legally own 60% of the bakery property. The rest was transferred to a holding company, your son, I assume, but your share was never officially sold. And considering the area's development since then, he whistled softly, that property's worth at least 3 times what it was when you sold the business. I felt my heart beat steady, each word sinking like a stone into still water. And the cafe that's there now, I asked. Clara's cousin runs it. He nodded. Then they're technically leasing your share without your consent. You could demand back payment. Quite a sum, I'd imagine. I sat back, the weight of his words filling the room. I expected to feel triumphant, maybe even angry. But what I felt was clarity, and unexpected calm that came from finally understanding my place in the story. For months, I had been treated like a ghost, yet here was proof that I'd never vanished. My work, my effort, my name, it all still held value, not just sentimentally, but legally, tangibly. Mr. Rosen leaned forward. You have every right to pursue this, Eleanor, with interest you could easily. I raised a hand gently. I don't want to sue them. He blinked. You do. No, I smiled faintly. I don't want revenge, Isaac. I just want peace and maybe a bit of justice, but the quiet kind. He studied me, nodding slowly. Then what do you have in mind? I looked out his window. Across the street stood the old public library where I used to take David on rainy afternoons. Beyond it, I could see the bakery's roofline, sunlight glinting off the sign that no longer bore my name. Do you remember the Women's Foundation my friend Helen started years ago? I asked. They help widows start small businesses, bakers, seamstresses, women like me. Mr. Rosen's eyes softened. I do. You baked for their first fundraiser, didn't you? I did. My voice grew steadier. I want to donate my 60% share to them in Samuel's memory. He always believed that when life takes something from you, you give back twice. He smiled almost wistfully. That's quite a gesture, Eleanor. It's not a gesture, I said quietly. It's closure. We spent the next 2 hours sorting through the paperwork, reviewing the legal language, ensuring every signature and witness line was in order. When it was done, I looked at the document in front of me, one signature that would transfer my share of the building to the foundation. I hesitated for a moment, pen hovering, then signed with a steady hand. As the ink dried, I felt something loosen inside me. It wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming dignity, the power to decide to give freely when others had taken without asking. The next day, the story appeared in the County Herald. Local woman DONATES historic property share two women's foundation. Former bakery owner Eleanor Mitchell gifts majority ownership of landmark building to support struggling women entrepreneurs. Beneath the headline was a photograph of me standing with the foundation's director, both of us holding the deed. My smile looked small but sure. The article mentioned my late husband's name, my years of community service, and how the donation would create grants for women over 50 to start their own small businesses. I hadn't planned on publicity, it was the foundation's idea, but I didn't mind. The story spread quickly through town. Neighbors who hadn't called in years left messages of congratulations. Old bakery customers sent notes of gratitude, saying they still remembered the smell of my cinnamon bread on winter mornings. And somewhere, a copy of that newspaper landed on David's breakfast table. I imagined the scene, Clara reading the headline aloud, her voice catching, Margaret's fork pausing midair, David lowering his coffee cup slowly, eyes fixed on my name in print. For a moment, the house that once made me feel invisible would fill with the sound of my presence again, not through confrontation, but through quiet consequence. Later that evening, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, there was a pause before a voice I knew too well spoke. "Mom." It was David. For a second, neither of us said anything. The silence carried the weight of months, maybe years of unspoken words. "I saw the article," he finally said. "You gave away the bakery, why didn't you tell me?" I took a deep breath, because it wasn't yours to worry about. He sighed. "You could have sold it, you could have." "Bought my way back into respect," I interrupted gently. "No, David, that's not what I needed." He went quiet. I could hear the faint murmur of Clara's voice in the background, Margaret asking something, then the sound of him walking away. "I didn't know you still own part of it," he said softly. "I know," I replied. "There were a lot of things you didn't know." He didn't argue. "Mom, David," I said, my tone warm but firm, "this isn't about guilt, it's about grace. I did what I needed to do for me, for your father's memory, for the women who will get a second chance." He exhaled slowly, the way he used to when words failed him. "You always find a way to make me feel small and proud at the same time." I smiled through the lump in my throat. "Then maybe you're learning something." When I hung up, I sat in my chair for a long while, letting the evening light spill through the window. I thought of Samuel, of the life we built from flour and hope, and I whispered, "We did it, love. We turned loss into legacy." Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and somewhere in the distance, the bell above the bakery door chimed as someone entered. I liked to think it was a new beginning for another woman who had once been told she was finished. And as for me, I wasn't finished either. I was just beginning to remember what freedom truly felt like. The night of the charity dinner arrived, bathed in the soft gold of early autumn. The air carried that gentle crispness that always reminded me of baking mornings, cool at dawn, warm by noon, alive with purpose. The old bakery building had been transformed for the event. Where the scent of fresh bread once lingered, the foundation had strung fairy lights along the beams, and white tablecloths draped the counters that had once held my trays of pastries. The sign above the door now read Mitchell Hall, a name they insisted on keeping to honor my donation. As I stepped inside, I paused for a moment beneath that sign, breathing in the mix of nostalgia and pride that swirled through the air. For the first time in years, the building didn't make me ache, it made me stand taller. The chatter of guests filled the space, glasses clinking, soft music playing in the background. The mayor himself was present, along with business owners, teachers, and families who'd once bought their morning rolls from me. "Eleanor," a voice called warmly. I turned to see the director of the Women's Foundation hurrying toward me. "You look radiant. Everyone been asking for you." I smiled, smoothing the skirt of my navy blue dress. I didn't think people would even remember me. "Remember you?" she laughed softly. "Half this town grew up on your bread, the other half's about to benefit from your kindness." The words landed deep in my chest. Kindness. For so long I had been treated like a burden. Tonight I was being seen again, not as someone discarded, but as someone who still mattered. The dinner began with speeches, laughter, and the faint hum of silverware against porcelain. I sat near the front next to the mayor, whose kind eyes twinkled as he raised his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight we honor a woman whose generosity has breathed new life into our community. Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell, your gift has allowed 10 women to open small businesses of their own. You've turned what once was loss into legacy." Applause filled the room, gentle at first, then swelling until it felt like the walls themselves were clapping. I felt my throat tighten. I'd spent years feeling invisible, now every pair of eyes seemed to look my way with warmth. As I rose to acknowledge them, I saw him. David stood near the back, his arm loosely around Clara, both dressed in the polished elegance that came so easily to them now, but they weren't smiling. Clara's gaze flickered nervously between me and the podium, and beside her, Margaret sat stiff, her jaw set like stone. The sight of her here, in this place, my place, might once have pierced me. Now it only steadied me. David caught my eye, and for a fleeting moment I saw something rather shame, maybe, or longing. He nodded faintly, as if asking permission just to exist in the same room again. I gave him a small nod in return, not of forgiveness yet, but acknowledgement. The mayor motioned for me to come to the stage. I walked slowly, letting the moment sink into every step. My heels echoed softly against the floorboards I once scrubbed by hand, each tap a quiet reminder that no one, not time, not betrayal, had managed to erase me. "Would you like to say a few words?" the mayor asked, offering me the microphone. I took it, feeling its weight in my palm. The room fell silent. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm but clear. "I never thought I'd stand here again, not in this building, not in front of so many faces I love." I paused, glancing around the room. Years ago, this place was a bakery. My husband, Samuel, and I built it from nothing but early mornings, sore hands, and dreams. When he passed, I kept it alive for our son. Every loaf, every pie was a piece of our story. A murmur of nostalgia rippled through the guests. I smiled softly. And like all stories, ours had chapters of loss. Life took things from me, people, places, a sense of belonging. But what I learned is this: sometimes losing what you thought was yours gives you the chance to discover what truly is. I glanced briefly at David, then at Margaret, whose expression remained frozen. "When you build your home on disrespect," I said quietly, "even the walls remember. But when you build it on love, on purpose, it stands forever." A hush fell so thick you could hear the faint creak of the rafters. The words hung there, not bitter but absolute, like truth finally spoken aloud after years of silence. I continued, "This building no longer belongs to me. It belongs to every woman who has been told she's past her prime, every widow who thought her worth died with her husband, every mother who was made to feel like her story ended when someone else's began. Tonight, this hall belongs to them." Applause rose again, slowly, respectfully, like a wave that built strength the longer it moved. I saw tears in the eyes of strangers, women nodding, some clutching each other's hands. Even the mayor dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. But my gaze found David again. He stood completely still, eyes glistening, his face pale. Clara's hand rested on his arm, but he didn't move. He just stared at me, a thousand unsaid apologies trembling behind his silence. And behind them, Margaret sat with her lips pressed tight, her composure cracking as her grip on her purse whitened her knuckles. For the first time, she looked small, like a woman who realized too late that power borrowed from cruelty never lasts. I finished with a gentle smile. "Thank you for reminding me that even broken hearts can feed others. That's what Samuel would have wanted. That's what I want too." When I stepped down, people stood to applaud. Hands reached out to shake mine, to thank me, to tell me stories of how the bakery once made their childhood sweeter. I nodded, smiled, and accepted their kindness, but my eyes drifted again toward the back of the room. David was walking forward slowly, hesitantly, like a boy approaching his mother for forgiveness after breaking something precious. When he reached me, he didn't speak right away. His voice trembled when he finally said, "You look just like Dad used to say you would when you were proud of yourself." I felt my throat close up. "And you," I said softly, "look like the man I raised. I've missed him." He lowered his head. "Mom, I'm sorry." I nodded, the corners of my eyes stinging. "I know." Behind him, Margaret approached, still composed but rattled. "Eleanor," she said stiffly, "you've made quite the spectacle tonight." I met her gaze evenly. "No, Margaret, I've made peace." She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left for her to take from me. As the evening wound down, people mingled around tables decorated with roses, ironically, roses from my old garden. The foundation had cultivated them from cuttings I'd donated, naming the variety Second Bloom. When I saw the sign, I smiled to myself. Even flowers, it seemed, knew how to start again. The mayor called me over for photographs, and David stood beside me for one of them. His arm brushed mine, tentative but familiar. When the flash went off, I caught Clara's eyes glistening from across the room. For the first time, her smile wasn't polite, it was remorseful. Maybe she finally understood that grace isn't weakness and dignity doesn't need permission to shine. Later, as I left the hall, I paused at the door and turned back one last time. The lights glowed soft and golden, laughter filling the air. The building no longer felt haunted by the past. It pulsed with new stories, new beginnings. I stepped outside, the cool night wrapping around me like an old friend. The town was quiet, save for the faint music drifting through the open windows of Mitchell Hall. I walked down the steps slowly, my heels clicking against the pavement, every sound a small declaration of triumph. I didn't need anyone to tell me what had just happened. Tonight wasn't revenge, it was restoration. And in that gentle evening air, I realized something I'd been too broken to believe before. Sometimes the sweetest justice doesn't come from making others fall. It comes from rising so gracefully they have no choice but to look up. 3 weeks passed after the charity dinner, and for the first time in a long while my days unfolded in peace. I had fallen into new rhythm, quiet mornings with coffee and the newspaper, afternoons helping at the Women's Foundation office, and evenings spent tending to the small balcony garden outside my apartment. The roses, their cuttings from my old ones, had begun to bloom again, their scent soft but certain, just like the woman I was becoming. I no longer checked my phone waiting for David's calls. I no longer replayed old words in my head asking what I could have done differently. For the first time in years, I simply was, not someone's mother, not someone's burden, just Eleanor, a woman who had lived, lost, and learned. Then one quiet Sunday afternoon, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found David standing there. He looked different, smaller somehow, though not in stature. His shoulders sagged, his eyes tired, his face pale in the soft light. In his hands he held a brown paper bag clutched so tightly it looked like a lifeline. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice almost a whisper. For a moment, I just looked at him, letting the sight of him settle in. The last time I saw my son, he was standing in a room full of people, drowning in his own guilt while I rose above it. Now he stood before me, just a boy again, lost, repentant, unsure of his place. "Come in," I said quietly. He stepped inside, eyes wandering around the apartment as if trying to understand the life I'd made without him. The furniture was simple, the air filled with the faint scent of rosewater and baked bread. He smiled faintly at that. "You're still baking," he murmured. "I never stopped," I replied. "Would you like some tea?" He nodded, and I motioned for him to sit at the small table by the window. I filled the kettle and set 2 cups down, letting the silence stretch comfortably between us. When I finally sat across from him, he cleared his throat. "I don't know where to start," he said. "Everything I've been meaning to say feels too small now." "Then just start with the truth," I said softly. He looked down, rubbing his thumb over the rim of his cup. "I was a coward, Mom. I let people decide for me, Clara, Margaret, even my own fears. I thought keeping peace meant keeping quiet. I thought I could balance everything without losing anyone, but I lost you." His voice cracked at the end, and he looked up quickly as if ashamed of his own emotion. I stayed still, watching him, not to judge, but to understand. "I saw you at the dinner," he continued. "I saw how everyone looked at you, how I used to look at you when I was proud. You didn't just give away a building, you gave away everything I thought I controlled, and somehow you still came out richer." The words hung between us, heavy but honest. He took a shaky breath. "Margaret doesn't come around much anymore. Clara, been quiet. I think she's realized what we became, what we let happen, and I just keep thinking about you, packing your things that night. I didn't even help, I just watched." I folded my hands around my cup. "You made a choice," I said gently. "I made her choice," he corrected, "and I've been paying for it every day since." The kettle whistled softly behind us, its steam rising like a sigh. I got up, poured the tea, and placed the cups between us. The warmth filled the small space, a simple comfort that words could never quite manage. He reached into the paper bag and pulled out a tin. "I made these," he said with a faint, embarrassed laugh. "They're supposed to be your oatmeal cookies. I followed your old recipe." I opened the tin and smiled. They were uneven, some a little too dark around the edges, others too thick, but the smell was right, homey, familiar. I took a small bite, dry, a little crunchy, but full of heart. "Not bad," I said. He chuckled, shoulders easing a little. "Ethan helped me. He said Grandma always let him lick the spoon. I told him that's how we know it's love." I looked at him, eyes softening. He remembers that. Every bit of it. We sat in silence again, sipping tea, sharing crumbs, letting years of hurt dissolve into the rhythm of small sounds, the spoon against the cup, the wind brushing the window pane. Finally, he said, "Mom, I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I see it now, all of it. The sacrifices, the love, the way you carried me even when I didn't deserve it. I'm sorry I forgot who you were." I studied his face, older now, but still carrying traces of the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap. Words rose to my lips, but I didn't speak them. Instead, I reached into the small drawer beside the table and pulled out a framed photograph. It was a picture of Samuel holding a young David on his shoulders in front of the bakery. Both of them were laughing, that open, unguarded joy I hadn't seen in years. I placed it on the table between us. "He'd want you to remember who raised you," I said softly. David looked at the photo, his eyes shining. "I do now," he whispered. We stayed like that for a long time, not mother and son divided by guilt, but two people bound by something that hadn't quite died. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Can I visit again?" I nodded. "You can always visit." He smiled, relief flickering through the sorrow. "I'll bring Ethan next time. He's been asking about your garden." "Tell him it's waiting for him," I said. After he left, I stood by the window, watching his car pull away. The road shimmered faintly in the late afternoon light, and I felt something I hadn't in a long while, not just peace, but release. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't something you give in words. It's something that lives quietly in how you choose to move forward. I turned back to the table, to the photo of Samuel and David. The light caught the glass just right, making their smiles glow as if the years between us had folded away. I touched the frame gently and whispered, "He's finding his way back." Outside, a breeze brushed through the roses on my balcony, scattering a few petals onto the floor. I bent down, gathered them in my palm, and smiled. Some things, once broken, bloom again, softer, smaller perhaps, but stronger for having survived. And so did we. The weeks that followed settled into something I could only describe as grace, not the loud, triumphant kind that announces itself to the world, but the quiet, steady grace that hums beneath a peaceful life. My mornings belonged to the sun again. I wake early, open the curtains, and let the light spill across the floor like forgiveness itself. The kettle's whistle became my church bell, marking a new kind of worship, one made of routine, gratitude, and the small miracle of simply waking without bitterness. I found purpose again at the Women's Foundation. What started as a few volunteer hours turned into a calling. I taught baking workshops every Tuesday and Thursday, simple things at first, bread, tarts, muffins, but the lessons were never really about recipes. They were about reclaiming confidence, about teaching women that strength doesn't fade with age or loss, it just changes shape. Many of the women were widows or single mothers. Some were fresh out of painful divorces, some were starting over after decades of being told they were too old to matter. I recognized parts of myself in every one of them, the hesitation, the quiet doubt, the hunger for something beyond survival. During one session, a woman named Teresa told me, "I thought I was done, Eleanor. I thought life had already decided who I was supposed to be." I smiled and pressed her hand gently. "Then surprise it," I said. She laughed, and for a moment I saw the spark return to her eyes, the same spark I, once lost and found again. The bakery's old building, now Mitchell Hall, had become the foundation's heart. Every time I walked through its doors, I still caught a faint trace of cinnamon and yeast in the walls. Sometimes I imagined Samuel standing by the old counter, flour on his hands, winking at me the way he used to when we were young and invincible. The space was alive again, not as a business, but as a place of rebirth. And that, I realized, was the truest form of legacy. David came by every Sunday now, sometimes with Ethan, sometimes alone. We didn't talk much about the past anymore, we didn't need to. He'd sit at my table, sipping tea, watching me knead dough for the next class. Sometimes he'd help, his big hands clumsy but eager, like a boy trying to make up for lost years. "Mom," he said once, rolling the dough too thick, "Ethan told his teacher you're famous now." I laughed softly. "Famous? Hardly, maybe I'm just useful again." He looked up, eyes warm. "You've always been that, I just forgot how to see it." Forgiveness had become our unspoken language, not the dramatic kind that ends in tears, but the quiet one found in gestures, in shared meals, in the gentle way he hugged me before leaving each time. Sometimes, when I walked through town, people stopped me to talk about the article or the foundation or just to reminisce about the bakery. But what touched me most were the young women who came up shyly after my classes. "You gave me hope," they'd say. "You made me believe it's not too late." Those words felt heavier than any apology or award. They were proof that what had once been taken from me had found its way back into the world, multiplied, repurposed, made whole again. One morning, I took the long way home from the foundation, walking past the old oak tree Samuel and I planted behind the bakery all those years ago. It had grown enormous, its branches arching over the sidewalk like an embrace. I sat beneath it, feeling the rough bark against my hand, and for the first time I understood something I hadn't before. It wasn't the eviction that had broken me, it wasn't even the betrayal. It was the quiet moment afterwards, sitting in my car that night, staring at a house that no longer wanted me, when I realized I had forgotten my own worth. I had built my identity around being needed, around belonging to others, and when that vanished, I mistook it for losing myself. But sometimes, losing your place is how you find yourself again. That truth had taken me a lifetime to learn. Now, when I closed my eyes at night, I didn't see that house or the faces that cast me out. I saw the women in my classes laughing over their first perfect loaf, the little boy in the front row who told his mother he wanted to be just like Mrs. Mitchell, and the foundation's plaque that read in honor of Samuel and Eleanor Mitchell, builders of hope. The past no longer haunted me, it guided me. The pain I once resented had ripened into something else, wisdom perhaps, not the kind that shouts lessons, but the kind that simply lives them. Every so often I'd receive a letter or a small box in the mail from women who'd graduated from the program. Inside, there'd be cookies, tiny loaves, or handwritten notes. "I opened my shop," one said. "Thank you for believing in me before I believed in myself." I'd place each one on the shelf above my kitchen window, small reminders that no good thing ever truly disappears. It just finds new hands, new hearts, new beginnings. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I stood on my balcony watering the roses. The air smelled like rain on warm pavement. Below, children laughed, chasing a ball down the street. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang and I felt a quiet fullness settle in my chest. I wasn't the woman who'd left that house in tears anymore. I wasn't the widow clutching memories like lifelines. I was someone else, someone freer, lighter, finally at peace. I leaned on the railing, watching the petals catch the fading light, and whispered, "You did it, Eleanor." Not as praise, but as acknowledgement of the journey, the bruises, the strength it took to bloom again. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't need anyone to answer back. If you've listened this far, maybe you've felt something familiar tug at your heart. Maybe you know what it's like to give everything you have to someone, your time, your energy, your dreams, and one day realize they stopped seeing the person behind all that giving. I used to think being a good mother meant never saying no, never standing up, never choosing myself. But love without self-respect isn't love, it's quiet disappearance. So if your children ever make you feel unwanted, please hear me now. Your worth doesn't depend on their choices. You were whole long before they arrived, and you remain whole even when they forget that. Love them, yes, always love them, but never lose yourself trying to earn a place that was already yours. There was a time when I thought forgiveness meant forgetting. I don't believe that anymore. Forgiveness, I've learned, is remembering without reopening the wound. It's the way your heart sighs when you finally stop carrying someone else's mistakes on your back. It's not a gift to them, it's a gift to yourself. I still think about that night, my car filled with boxes, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, my home shrinking behind me. I thought I was driving away from everything I knew, but in truth, I was driving toward myself. The woman who arrived at that tiny apartment wasn't the same one who left that big house. She was raw, yes, but she was ready to rediscover what she'd forgot, her own strength. You see, the world can make older women feel invisible, like we've already had our turn, like our stories have no new pages left to write. But that's a lie, a cruel one. Every season of life brings its own kind of bloom, and sometimes it's the late bloom that smells the sweetest. When I walk into Mitchell Hall now and see those women laughing, measuring flour, wiping their hands on aprons, I see pieces of my own rebirth reflected in their faces. Each one carries a story: betrayal, loss, grief, courage. They remind me that dignity isn't given by others, it's reclaimed one brave choice at a time. And as for David, we're learning each other again. Slowly, tenderly. I don't pretend the past didn't happen, but I also don't live there anymore. The door between us isn't locked, it just opens differently now. There's honesty on both sides. He visits often, and sometimes when he leaves, he hugs me longer than before, as if trying to make up for the years that silence stood between us. I let him. Some hugs aren't apologies, they're prayers. There's a quote I keep written on a scrap of paper above my desk. It says, "We don't grow old when we stop loving, we grow old when we stop forgiving." I read it every morning before heading to the foundation. It reminds me that life, no matter how bruised, is still generous to those who stay open to it. If you're listening and your heart feels heavy, maybe because of a son who's drifted away, a daughter who's forgotten your worth, or a family that no longer sees your light, let me tell you this. You are not alone. You belong to every woman who's ever started over, every soul who's ever rebuilt a home out of nothing but courage and faith. You don't need a grand act to take your power back. Sometimes it's as simple as waking up tomorrow and deciding you deserve peace, not someday, not if someone apologizes, but now. I used to sit by my window and ask God why my son turned away from me. I don't ask that anymore. Instead, I thank him for giving me the strength to keep my heart soft in a world that can be so hard. That's what keeps me alive, not bitterness, not revenge, but softness. Because even after everything, love still lives here. And maybe that's the truest kind of justice, when you can look at the people who hurt you and wish them healing instead of harm. When you can let go, not because they deserve it, but because you do. So my dear listener, I'll leave you with this. If your children ever make you feel unwanted, remember your worth isn't something they can give or take. It's yours, written deep into your soul. Love them, yes, but never love them so hard that you forget to love yourself. And if you ever find yourself sitting in a car like I did, staring at a house you once called home, don't see it as an ending. See it as an invitation to return to yourself, to rise, to begin again. The music of life doesn't stop when someone walks out of your story, it just changes key. So take a breath, stand tall, keep your dignity close and your kindness closer. The people who once overlooked you will one day have to raise their eyes to meet yours. And when they do, smile. Because forgiveness is the quietest victory there is. Soft pause. Tell me, would you forgive your child if they ask too late?